A lot of churches are planted out of this antagonistic presupposition they're going to prove somebody wrong, and they haven't even been members of a church.
Welcome to the Grimké podcast. Good to have all of you here. We have Dr. Doug Ponder.
Hey.
We have Professor Bryan Laughlin.
Glad to be here. I love everybody thinks through their little entrance. You're like, hey. And I was like, yeah, what am I going to say? But I'm glad to be here.
President Doug Logan. Excited to have you. I am Joe Holland, and we're excited about have this conversation in particular.
The salute is classic. Yes.
We are talking church planting today, which is a fun topic for a lot of different reasons. The importance of church planting, but also it's how we all met. So 2000, I think you were a little earlier than us three. We met 2009 church planting. We were at the same assessment together.
Right.
I think you started
06
church planting. So it'd be fun to tell a little bit of our stories. We are here right now at Remnant Church recording this. So tell us a little bit about
15 years later.
Still here.
I mean, that's one thing we do have in common. We're all church planners.
Yeah.
Yes.
And so we've met through the journey and here today. It's so there's a lot to say about church planting. I'd love to hear, Perez, your story. Joe, you and I met, like you said, in those days.
Yeah.
You got assessed, and then you would immediately go and somehow assess somebody else. It was amazing. So
within like 3 weeks, you were assessing somebody else.
Within like 3 hours.
Yeah, Joe and I had like planned it 5 minutes before, and then we were assessing planners.
On an assessment team together, right.
The dogmatism was always thick in the room too, of like, I know exactly how to do it. I started yesterday.
Credentialed.
Yeah, so
it was fraternity. It's like hazing.
It was. So good times, but that's where we met 15 plus years ago, and then Doug, we met not too long after that. But you had already planned it before all of us in Camden, though.
Yeah.
So I love your story, especially
fascinating.
Even how you came to faith, because you basically almost got semi-raptured, I think, and then you ended up. So why don't you kick us off?
It's true.
Where?
Well, man, I grew up in Patterson, New Jersey, National Baptist. My mother was a National Baptist, and so we came up, and upon her death, I moved with my sister. So we floated around within that Baptist world. Didn't know Christ. I was a hood Christian. We went to church as a part of life, and you
working as a barber back then?
I owned a barber shop, Final Hair Phase back in the day. Opened it in 1990.
Was that the name of it?
Final Hair Phase.
I did not know that.
Final Hair Phase.
The Final Phase.
You don't need to go nowhere else.
Final Hair Phase.
Wow.
I think you're past your Final Hair Phase.
I almost named the church Final Hair Phase. Final Bible Phase.
The Lord's brought us from a long way, hasn't he?
So I'm dating this atheist girl, and I'm a fake Christian. And so, man, I went to a Bible study, a crazy dispensational Bible study, and I ain't mad at dispensationals. I disagree with you, but I ain't mad. And so,
the future podcast, we'll tackle that. But keep going.
Right episode.
I'm not.
But I just remember my boy Jay Sykes was there, and Ty Tribbett had been in my ear with the gospel because I was cutting Ty Tribbett's hair, and he was always jamming me up that I was going to hell. And then I go to this dispensational Bible study, and they talked about the rapture, and you're gonna have to get 666 tattooed on your head to get food and
get left behind
to get your head cut off. And
about when was this? When was it? 90s?
This was 1996.
Yeah. Okay.
1996.
Right. Yeah, that
1996.
Right.
Yeah. So.
Yep.
So I'm like, all right. So I go home, living with my atheist girlfriend, unmarried, of course, both of us unsaved, and I live next to the fire department in Morristown, New Jersey, on Camden Ave. And I remember the fire alarm going off, and I ran outside looking for crash planes because at the dispensational Bible study, they said if the pilot's a Christian,
these planes are going to crash.
The planes are going to crash, and then the cars are going to be crashed on the road, and people are just going to be zonked out. So I run outside about 3 a.m. looking for crash planes. Mind you, I didn't go up to the bed that night to because I had a holy moment. I'm not going to go upstairs and be in the bed and be shacked up, I think the phrase we used back then. And then
Casey was still scooping them up. I mean, you ain't been left behind yet.
Exactly.
Yeah, it might have been in process.
Get your act together.
Amen. He might have gave me a grace period, like my credit card. And so I called the Christian who had been sharing the gospel, who I went to the Bible study with, my boy Jay Sykes, and I'm scared to call him because if he doesn't answer, he's gone, or he might be asleep. So if he's, then I gotta wait till the morning. And then if he doesn't come to work, he worked at the barbershop with me, then I'm left behind. And so praise God for star 69. So I remember that. So I called, and he finally called me back and said, I can't tell you what he said, but he said something rough to me.
It was 3 a.m. Exactly.
Like, what are you calling me for? I said, praise the Lord. I'll see you in the morning. So that morning,
amazing.
So I go up and tell
This is the best pitch for dispensational theology I've ever heard of. People come into the kingdom because of this stuff. And you can't be overlooked. But keep going.
So I go upstairs and I tell my atheist girlfriend, hey, I do want to keep having sex with you and being with you, but they prophesied over me that I was going to be a pastor, and I just became a pastor tonight and a Christian. And
became a pastor.
I was a pastor that night.
Oh my God.
That was the prophecy. I was going to be a pastor.
Wow, yeah.
This was Ty who had prophesied over you?
Oh, well.
We're going to need to come back to calling, by the way.
Right.
We're going to do a whole episode on prophecy, too.
Right. We are.
I can feel it.
So, yeah.
Crooked stick, straight path.
Well, Jay, the barber who worked with me, he had a Ministers Monday, because back then barbershops were closed on Monday. So all the preachers would be in there Monday. So I go in the barbershop and they're all prophesying over me, declaring it and rebuking me and saying, we know you dating that girl, and we know you act like we don't know your little pro-black self, that you dating that white girl undercover. But when you stop running your mouth for the devil and start running for God, God's going to save you. You're going to have these little mixed kids running around loving Jesus, and you're going to lose, and you're going to have to preach the gospel to all these little people you've been leading astray in this barbershop.
This is why we don't have prophecy mics on Sunday.
So they said, we pull it down, we declare it over you. You will be a pastor, and blah, blah, blah. And so when I came to faith the next week, it was like,
That's what they said.
I'm a pastor right now. So I tell my wife, my girlfriend at that time, Angel, she says, do you mean just go to church and stuff? So I said, yeah. So we got up that morning. I drove to Elkton, Maryland, where you could get married. And we drove to Elkton, Maryland, which is the first exit across the Delaware line. Went through the drive-through wedding thing.
Jersey wouldn't let you get married.
Nah, it was 3 weeks.
They won't let you pump your own gas either.
So I'm married, and within 2 weeks, I'm preaching on the streets in front of Family Court on Vine Street in Philadelphia to the homeless people. And yeah, that was me.
Wow.
Came to faith just through that whole process. And,
you didn't end up in Camden the next week, though, did you?
No.
How did you end up planting?
Well, for me, planting was I come out. So I'm sharing the gospel with different type of people at the shop, not pretty church people at that time for me. And so half the people I was leading to Christ, when they would come to my very traditional church, they still smelled like weed. They still wore Jordans and hoodies and their pants sagging. And so the Lord just put a burden on me to plant from that initial statement that I was going to start a church for these people from back in the barbershop, from the prophecy, if you will. And so I went and served at a church in Kensington, which was an all-white church. I was the first member of a 100-year-old church that was African-American, and I was the pastor. So I was there. It ate my lunch. It was a huge building with only like 70 people. We couldn't survive. So I went to a residency, and then during that time, I was with Paul Tripp, Phil Reich, and Eric Mason were coaching and nurturing me. And then they both, I won't say prophecy, but both of them, but Phil Reich said to me, Doug, you're not going to plant in Germantown, which I was slated to plant, which is a neighborhood near, not far from 10th. And he says, you're not planting in Germantown. You're going to plant in Camden. And so I said, Phil, you go plant in Camden with your little pretty hair. You go plant in Camden. I ain't planting in no Camden. And so I leave there sort of upset from staff meeting at 10th, and I get to staff meeting at Epiphany, which I was doing a dual residency.
Right.
And Mason walks in and says, I was praying last night, and God put on my heart that you ain't planting in Germantown, you planting again. I said, did Phil call you?
It's a conspiracy, a residency.
So I go over to Camden. Me and Angel go over, and I'm saying, let's go over.
Your wife's name is Angel.
My wife's name is Angel. So let's go over and prove that God ain't calling us. So we go over there, and Angel begins to cry bitterly after we looking at the hood. And she says, Doug, we got to plant a church here. I said, yeah, we're going to pray that somebody does plant a church here. Right. Now we're going home. So I went home. I came back late that night. And the Lord just put a burden on me for Camden, America's most dangerous, most violent city. Living in Philly, I could get to Camden in 10 minutes because it's right at the bridge. So, man, that was my burden. I got over there and I sensed the call. I couldn't shake it. I tried to shake it. And, of course, Riken and Mason said, I told you, right. Forget y'all. And so, so that was my heart.
And when was that? When did you plant in Camden?
I planted 2011, but that moment was 2009, early 2009 was that moment which I went to plant in 2011. And from that we planted.
So it was around like a 10-year journey then.
Yeah.
Ish.
Yeah. So from 2002, when I was the pastor of Calvary Bible Church in the hood, all the way to Camden, which was 2011, and to be there, it was a long journey. I went to Westminster for a little bit, RTS for a little bit, and
a lot along the way.
A lot along the way.
I think a lot of our stories are similar. I always feel like I was an accidental church planter. I came to faith in my early 20s out of a lot of stuff, but I lost a lot of friends.
Sure.
And ended up going to this Baptist church south of Richmond. Actually, in the hometown, I grew up south of Richmond. And it was a wonderful church, but also I was new in a lot of ways because I didn't have a lot of friends. I didn't necessarily grow up in the church. Except for I was real little, parents got divorced, and then I was just out for over a decade and some. So coming back in early 20s, they also didn't have a lot of folks that were single in their early 20s, maybe young families, some other folks, but it was just all strange. So I had, and also wanted to know, what does it look like to be a Christian and grow? So I had like kind of a nomadic period of just trying to read everything in the book, every book I get my hands on. So my theology,
Barnes and Noble.
Yeah, the Barnes and Noble theological corpus can make you crazy.
That was real.
To be honest, I went from a MacArthurite one day to the Barbarian Way the next day with Erwin McManus,
Bill Gothard.
then John Eldridge was getting after my heart or something like that. I mean, it was
Taste of the Wild.
And then I would go, and it was a Baptist church. So they probably asked me within like a couple months to like, hey, you should teach. So I would read a book and then teach that dogmatically, like this is exactly what the scriptures say. I mean, it was.
I read last week.
Yeah. I did that for a few years. Ended up teaching middle schoolers, and I went to the pastor and said, hey, I just feel like I want to make sure I'm not leading everybody in the wrong direction. And essentially they said, the Lord's calling you to seminary. I said, is he? I was just thinking maybe we could do a book study or something.
Maybe we could meet.
Maybe we could meet first before I go to seminary. So it was their Baptist version of a prophecy. So I said, okay, let me pray about it. The Lord moved a lot of circumstances and all types of confirming ways in my life. Ended up in seminary just to teach middle schoolers, Sunday school, really. And then over that journey, over half decade, and talking with different folks, I honestly was stacking up a lot of knowledge about Christianity, scriptures, those sorts of things. And teaching Sunday school, ended up doing young adults, but it still the penny wasn't dropping.
Yeah.
And all of a sudden, the gospel-centered movement kind of came on the scene in the mid-2000s. Well, it was a little bit earlier than that, but as far as like mainstream, it dovetailed with the internet getting out.
Sure.
Viral videos started happening. You download these clips. Like, look at Tim Keller, what he said there, or look at Mark Driscoll, what he said.
Sure.
And it kind of brought all of the scattered puzzle pieces of thought into focus around the gospel. And then they said, well, that leads to church planting in urban centers. I said, well, of course it does.
Yeah.
And so I talked to the pastors. I said, hey, I have a burden to reach those who are far from Christ. Love to see that happen. What do you guys think? And they, with great wisdom, said, yeah, we don't think you do well in an existing church. Why don't you, which I think was their way of saying, if you're gonna wreck everybody's lives, why don't you go do it by yourself and we'll pray for you.
That holy eviction.
Good luck.
So they were extremely loving, kind, commissioned Doug and I. Doug and I's friendship came on the scene through all those years, which you can talk about Doug. And somehow in 2009 ended up planting in Richmond. And just, here we are 15 years later, and it's been a great journey. But
Yeah.
it was very accidental. I just wanted to teach middle schoolers the Bible, to be honest.
Our church has been teaching through the book of Genesis recently, and been in the part of the book where they talk about Jacob's life. And so much of Jacob's life is a story of him wrestling with the Lord long before he literally wrestles with him. Right. The whole point of that event is, in a lot of ways, it was a picture of what God had been doing with that man to get him from where he was to where he needed to be. And it's a very fitting metaphor for my own story, which is a lot shorter and involves no angels and no prophecies. But long story short, I had grown up in the church, and from a very early age, people were telling me, oh, you've got teaching gifts. You're clearly going to be a pastor one day. And I didn't really
Sound like the barbershop.
Yeah, well, kind of. Okay. Just no prophecies, right?
Right.
And no clippers.
Yeah. I did need haircuts back then. I had a curly afro. It was 14 inches long. Those days
pictures.
are long gone.
We need pictures.
No, I praise God the Facebook wasn't around back then.
I've seen pictures. Looking back, I think it was a wig all along, to be honest.
It was not, but
We could bring it back.
these days.
I like how you called it the Facebook.
Yeah. The book of faces.
There it is.
Anyway, so I went to college, a Bible college, thinking, oh yeah, that's what you do if you're going to be a pastor. So I'd like to tell everybody, I went into college thinking I'm going to be a pastor, but I actually graduated thinking that's the last thing that I should ever do.
Right.
Not just the last thing I wanted to do, the last thing I should do, because I was a wreck. My time there was really bad, and maybe some of it was some weirdness at the school, but most of it was the state of my own soul.
God was wrestling with you.
He really was.
Yeah.
I was not even close to what who I should be. Mm-hmm. And so my problem was I had a lot of knowledge about the Bible, and not a lot of, if we can use an old school word, not a lot of piety, and not a lot of love for the Lord. I was serving from...
That's where we met.
It was. Bryan got in my face one summer. I'd been to church twice, and it was like a month or two between them. And the second time, he got in my face after Sunday school, the Sunday school class he was teaching at the time.
He kneeled down.
He didn't, but he cornered me, right? I thought I was going to get beat up, but he just said, he's like, what are you doing with your life? And I was like, I don't know. I mean, that was it. That was my problem.
I think at the time I just read John Piper, like, don't waste your life.
Yeah,
so
right.
that was my go-to question.
It was a great question.
Your life?
It was a great question. I was wasting my life.
Yeah, right.
And not just because, I could have been a pastor or something, but because I had no idea what I was doing. I was spinning my wheels. I was depressed. I was addicted to porn. I was 50 pounds overweight. I was in a horrible place. And the Lord used that conversation to start a friendship.
Yeah.
A year later, after kind of coming home, detoxing a little bit, working a couple jobs, trying to figure out what was next, Bryan's like, man, you ought to come to seminary with me. And I was like, I think that's a terrible idea. You remember how bad my experience was at this Bible college? And
But by the way, that ended up being like the providential, strange way that the Lord ended up leading us to plant. Was,
yes,
we didn't know what we were doing. I didn't either. But I was loving seminary because I was learning the Bible.
Yeah,
and then so I just invited everybody to seminary.
Yeah,
and of course Doug and I we were kicking off this wonderful friendship, and then I was like, you need to come. This is magic.
So I did. Magic. He had a little shed behind his house, so he let me sleep in.
It was better than that.
It had carpet on the floors. It had a futon.
I heard it was a dirt floor.
It had a hotel fridge, and it had this little heater unit that had two settings: Dragon's Breath and Bryan Laughlin Coals. That was it.
Yeah.
That was it.
Yes.
So I would wake up in the middle of the night sweating, and I would turn it down, and then I would wake up again because the sweat had frozen to my body. but I survived, and actually it was a wonderful time. Every night we're coming back from class, and we are talking about what we're learning, and we're praying, and sometimes wrestling, right? And about doctrine and what we're going to do when we graduate. And as you said, there were a lot of people who were coming to the seminary around that time that were saying, hey, if you care about the Great Commission and you care about the local church, then church planting is a thing for you. And we began praying about that. The Lord led us to start a church in Richmond. And at first, he just approached me and said, I want you to be part of this. And I was like, absolutely. And then like a few weeks later, he's like, I want you to be one of the founding pastors. And I was like, I don't know about that.
That was my prophecy. I grabbed him in the parking lot of the church and said, I think God's calling you to be an elder in the church when we start. And you're like, that's ridiculous.
So I was slow in coming to that, but the Lord was very kind to me and stayed with me through a lot of wilderness years and used a lot of people, especially this man.
To wrestle you.
To wrestle me, get me where I needed to be before I could ever be used by him to possibly help other people.
Well, it also relates. I mean, we may chase a little of this of things not to do, but the early years was you just run around and like baptize people as elders and start a church,
right?
Like so,
hope for the best.
You know, that we probably the Lord brought us through. We probably all needed some more wisdom along the way, I would say. But yeah.
No, I mean, for me, it was went to RTS, went to a big church in Mississippi out of there, big youth ministry, middle school, senior high ministry, and also college ministry, running a bunch of folks, bunch of interns, and then got called to a little town in Mississippi. We had 7,000 people, Walmart, a stoplight, and a Sonic.
Wow.
And so
that's legit, though.
Yeah.
I mean, that's a full. You got. I mean, our test for like full cityship was Waffle House. I mean,
oh yeah,
you had that.
That's a great
you're
test.
legit.
It's real.
You're
it's
legit.
a great test.
You get groceries and Sonic milkshakes. I mean, it's great. So
don't undersell it. Is all I'm saying. That's right.
No, it was we loved our time in Mississippi, but probably like y'all around that time. So in like 06 to 09, we were watching internet guys preaching, talking about church planting. Books were coming about church planting.
That's right.
And so just got excited about church planting. We wanted to get back to home state of Virginia and talk to the presbytery. And there was a group of people in Culpeper who were looking for a church planter. So they were there. There was no PCA church there. And I was like, well, I'm interested. So, you've got prophecy. You've got guys saying, you know what, you're a believer, go to seminary. I had a presbytery. So it's just that's how we all get called in.
This is the progression of how we confirm calling.
Exactly.
Full prophecy to Baptist versions of prophecy into full discerning Presbyterians.
That's right.
With academic calling.
That's right. There were motions and there were seconds. And,
I love it.
Right. So Mission Church. So joined that team in Culpeper in 09. But also dual affiliated. Just I wanted to be around other church planters. So had M&A, Mission North America through the PCA. Also Acts 29. All of us. Acts 29 was kind of getting
where we
somewhat big. We met there.
I was PCA with you then.
Yeah, you were PCA with me. We were some of the few PCA guys in Acts 29. Certainly enjoyed both of those affiliations. So, so there was there for 10 years. Yeah, and
I mean, those years there's a lot of excitement during those years.
Oh, absolutely.
Even all of us met through Acts 29.
Oh yeah,
which many folks have commentated in a good way over the years. The gospel-centered movement had its boots on the ground, affected mission through church planting out of Acts 29.
Absolutely.
I mean, so it was, you guys were planting churches. There was just a lot of energy. I don't know if there was necessarily more plants happening than now, but there was a lot of conversations, excitement.
And we were desperate. It was church planting is difficult and hard. And, we're brothers that I can find fellowship with. What do I need to be reading and thinking about for the next stage? And so, it came down to Richmond and we started hanging out, Commonwealth Collective, all those kinds of things, which is really kind of how our friendship started.
Right. Yeah. And Joe supported Epiphany Camden from the rip. I mean, he called me immediately.
Well, this is where Doug and I's friendship comes in because Doug and I we'd all meet at a lot of these events and we were all friends. And Doug used to, in his heart, kind of I don't say you hated me, but you had a disdain in a weird way because you were shaking pockets to get money.
And I thought you were a Confederate.
You do a little intimidating.
That was, of course, all a lie. I had the neo-evangelical beard at the time.
You did.
I was in full reform.
You were a cool dude. You were a cool dude, but you didn't give me money.
Well, what Doug and I came to find out later is we were both broke. He thought I had resources, but you ended up getting more support than I did. I just got offered jobs.
That's exactly
and
right.
so
the Presbyterians assume all the Baptists have the money. So
Amen.
Exactly opposite of how it is.
I mean, and that was a great conversation to have with Bryan. I was everybody. The joke was Doug will walk around. He picks churches' pockets with his urban stories, and so that would be my the joke on me. So Bryan, I was like, B, come on, man. You
got money.
You got that.
You don't care about the urban centers.
Help a brother out. You playing too much.
And the whole time I was like, why don't you give me some money?
Exactly.
And he was like, I know he's not broke.
He's a hater.
None of that's true.
And so to have that conversation was, we joking about it, but like he was like, we didn't raise a bunch of money, man. He says, I'm not even the highest paid pastor at the church right now. And
I didn't get paid the fourth year in planning. I was the third guy to come on staff as a lead planner.
Yeah. So that's where my heart began to connect with you was, you are a regular joker from a distance,
We don't have to get into all the stereotypes. But
from a distance, I didn't. You won't give me no money, so you were a hater.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. It's kind of broad brush, to be honest, but we don't chase that either. But
So God really used church planning to really form our friendships. Like the reason the four of us are around this table right now and working into seminary together is because we started out church planning. And the interesting thing about it, which is maybe gets us into talking about the current state of church planning, is it seemed like when we were planting, church planting was the popular thing to do. It seemed to be there was a wave of excitement about starting new churches in new areas. It was across denominations. It was multiple networks coming, being birthed, growing. So how do y'all think about that now? Because it doesn't feel like church planting is as popular, at least culturally within the church, as it was when we were. But maybe not. What are y'all thinking?
Your question about how do I think about it now, I think is key in this discussion a little bit, because there was great excitement. Biblically, there's great excitement of taking the gospel to those who don't know Christ, and the need is desperate. So there's always great enjoyment of we need to get this good news to the people that don't know the Lord yet. Mm-hmm. So in that sense, that's always before us. But there was great energy. And I'm not saying that there's not now. Of course, the question was why was that kind of at least a solid decade. It's probably a good 20 to 25 year period, but at least the height of the hype, if you will,
2005, 2015,
05 to 15-ish, somewhere in there. You had a lot of energy. Why that was the case, I have a lot of different thoughts at this point that I think are a little bit just more sober.
Yeah,
that's good. When you're young in your late 20s and your 30s, there's I would say life experience over time tempers you.
Sure,
that's just fair. It does that. So there wasn't much that I think we couldn't accomplish. I had a pastor I heard recently in the UK was preaching, and we planned about the same time, but he planted in Wales, in Cardiff, and he essentially said, when I started, I knew I was going to reach all of Wales for Christ. And then he went on to say, after about 5 to 10 years in, he said, I was going to make a big dent in Cardiff. And and then after 15 plus years, he said, Lord, I just want to make it to the end. And so I think there was a lot of the excitement was tempered over time of how do we actually plant effective church planting. We've seen a lot of different things, just a lot of different things come out of it over the years. So I'm just as excited about church planting as ever, but maybe tempered in what's needed to see
still crucial, still important.
As for why it was popular or popularized in that time period, and it was. If you look at something like, this is nerding out a little bit, but Google's Ngram viewer, you can look at
I've been there before.
Terminology. I go there often.
This is the first I'm hearing about it.
It's a diagnostic. I know this surprised nobody. It's a diagnostic that lets you track the frequency of use of terms and phrases in public or printed material, whether books and or the internet, over long stretches of time. And if you were to do that, you would look at the word church planting and you would see what it kind of was not used really at all until boom, all of a sudden, late 90s, early 2000s, it starts getting used. And then this is skyrocket effect. And so there was a surge in popularity of the term, of the phrase. And when we think about our own stories, we're all close to the same age. We're all in our 40s, 50s, early 50s. So there's a sense in which growing up, maybe we never heard this word. Yeah. But that doesn't mean nobody was doing it. It doesn't mean no one was starting new churches.
Well, it triggers a thought because you had a lot of cultural coalescence going on. You had the rise of the internet. So I remember when Mark Driscoll planted in Seattle, he was one of the internet was up and websites were up. Yeah. And it was one of the first places for you to actually use the web to affect the mission of the church.
Yes, right.
To facilitate the message of the church. Even so, online was just taking off, and so you had that. Even to be able to do the analytics of whether or not it was a popular word. I'm sure they're digging through all the libraries,
Right.
but there's some of it you just couldn't track with so much until it just kind of kicks in a little bit. So you had the evangelical church was pregnant in a lot of ways, as commentators would say, where you had addition-mindedness in the North American church landscape. Was we're going to add, grow just by addition, and then as you had these generational changes, but like when I came to faith in my early 20s. It wasn't that the church we were at didn't love Jesus. It wasn't that they weren't preaching the gospel and knew what Christ had done and were trying to live for him. It was that a lot of us looked around and said, most of my friends I'm trying to reach for Christ this is not even, it doesn't have them on the radar.
That's right.
And so you had the landscape shift where a lot of churchness. And of course, this varies per geographic region in the U.S., so it's not monolithic.
Yeah.
But you had a lot of moving from church to heavily unchurched to de-churching. Those sorts of phenomena were there.
Sure.
And then how do we reach them? What methods are going to be necessary? And you had a lot of guys that had been serving in the church, like we had almost 10 years teaching before we were planted, and different contexts in the life of the church said, hey, we probably need to plant in order to affect this. So those different factors that weighed in.
Yeah, my attraction was, to your point, Bryan, was the missiology dynamic for me. And so, yeah, churches were being planted, whatever name we came up with them, but by and large, from my experience, I didn't use the Google thing. By and large, from my experience, they were denominational churches, organization churches that sort of planted a brand flag.
Sure.
And then that brand showed up.
Would you say the denomination, when you mean like a denominational church, was like a model?
Yeah,
It was like a type.
It was like a type. Yeah. So if it was a Baptist church, then they would start a church, and then Baptists would come. Presbyterians would start They would get a group of people together, and then people would see the flag of the Presbyterian and come to that. What was different for me in 05, 06, listening to people like Ed Marcel, Mark Driscoll, and Eric Mason at that time was it went after a biblical picture, a biblical model, and it was heavy lost centered, not flag centered or tribe centered. And so that's what was the big deal for me was, hey man, we're going to go get lost people on the street. As a young non-preacher evangelist who thought I was a pastor, I was primarily an evangelist. And so when I found out that evangelism mattered,
right,
and church planting was a place where you could do evangelism, even if you're not that great of a pastor, which I wasn't, man, it was awesome to me. So it was the missiological aspect. That
I think it's big because that's actually kind of what led into a lot of our planting was Doug and I were part of, when we were at Southeastern Seminary, Southeastern Baptist Seminary. There was a discussion group we had that met like 6 a.m. about church planting, but essentially, and this relates to a little bit of the emergent church conversation. The emergent church conversation has one is a large conversation to have. But in its simplified form, at least incipiently at the beginning, it was saying, how do we look at America as a mission field?
Sure.
It was missiology.
Leslie Newbegin kind of thinking.
Yeah, exactly. How do we approach it?
Yeah.
Whereas a lot of the assumptions of the kind of existing church, those were back on the table of what do we need to do to actually reach them. And so a missiological component entered into the discussion in the U.S. church landscape and said, how do we do this well? We had that discussion early on. To your point about the denominational churches, we planted through the Conservative Baptists, the Southern Baptist Conservative in Virginia, and wonderful. But at the time, because we were planting in an urban context, very different than the rural surrounding context in a lot of ways. We were seen as a little bit more liberal leaning, which I always just kind of laughed and I was like, this is magical, if that's the thought. But it really is more of a missiological disjunct. They didn't have a way to process how you're taking rich your Reformed theology and saying, how do we apply this in planting a church? How does this relate to the gospel and overall health of those churches that we're planting?
I don't know that whether we've mentioned his name yet or not, but another huge factor here was Tim Keller wrote his church planting manual in the late 90s.
That's right.
Yeah. And all these guys that we have mentioned largely did what they did because of him.
I had
Well,
that
to your point,
spiral bound.
yes,
that you
yeah,
had to-
I still have it in my desk.
Like their
in my
church
office.
produced it. And I
You
took
had to go
those-
on the website, order. Was it like $75?
It was super
egregiously
expensive. Right.
It was printed on 8x11, 8.5 by 11,
Yep.
and then it showed up with ugly clip art on the cover, and
Comb
it
bound.
looked like scanned notes from a copywriter.
Doug and I took our core team through that and how we were thinking about planting.
That's right.
It was wild.
And so the popularity thing, right, is weird because some of that's your perception of what is popular, what is not
That's right.
popular. And so I was looking up some stats one time on this because
I'm
was
into
curious.
this. It's popular.
No, well, sure. I mean, that's what we think, right?
Yeah, that's
right.
right.
I'm into this. My friends are into this. Obviously, everybody's into this.
Everybody.
Nobody was
If
doing
you're
this.
cool.
Now everybody's doing this.
Right.
And you can feel like if it's less interesting to you now, you can think, oh, it's less popular now. But actually, I read some stats recently that not counting the COVID year when everybody lost their minds, there were more churches planted over the last few years than there were, the decade leading up to that. And so even if it feels less popular,
It does.
Actual stats say, no, there's more churches being started now than there were even, 10 years ago.
That's right. Good.
And that's just one factor here. The other factor is, even if it were slightly more popular now, whether people feel it like that or not, the fact is, if you think in terms of supply and demand, it's the number of churches that exist in America is still far fewer than the number that we would actually need to reach the people who do not know the Lord. I've read stats that say that the number of people in America who are not Christians and do not go to church, except at Christmas and Easter or something like that, is large enough that unreached group of people in America would be the 8th most populous nation in the world.
Yeah.
That's how many people are not Christians in America.
Right.
And those stats are skewed because they're also counting people who faithfully attend heretical, progressive churches that would call themselves Christians, but who believe in a Jesus that didn't rise from the grave. They don't think his words are true.
That's right.
And so if we start counting that, you start saying, my goodness, actually, that's a tremendous number of needs. It reminds me of the way the Prohibition movement affected breweries in America. The microbrewery explosion happened roughly around the same time the church planting explosion did.
Yeah.
It was like an entrepreneurial spirit. Everybody starts, they're like,
It was a
you know what?
providential backhanded blessing.
They're like variety. They're like, well,
Amen.
It turns out beer can be different than Bud Light, Miller Lite, and Coors Light. There could be something else. And so what happened was everybody starts making these microbreweries. They're showing up everywhere. And there's a sense, if you were living in that moment, you could be like, my gosh, there's more beer now than ever. But actually, by per capita rates, there are still fewer breweries in America, even after the microbrewery explosion, per capita, than there were before Prohibition shut most of them down. And so when you think about growing populations, you think about total number of non-Christians in America, you actually recognize there's still a huge need here, a huge need to reach people with the gospel and see churches planted in places where there are no gospel preaching churches that people can go to, be discipled, and on and on.
The landscape has shifted, though. I mean, I was thinking as you're talking about Dr. Keller, I mean, couldn't have had more of an impact on us. I mean, we're just so thankful for it. We loaded up like a small portion of our core team and went to this conference he was putting on in New York in 2008. It was like Mark Driscoll and Tim Keller and Dr. Mason was there. Dwell conference. Yeah, it was. But you also it was indicative of a lot of the cultural changes that were happening. We were able to know about the conference through the internet. And a lot of the conversation at the time was the way we impact culture is in and through the urban centers, because ideas flow in and through cities out institutionally in a lot of ways to the surrounding areas and that. So this was pre-smartphone. This is pre the full flattening of all things through the proliferation of smart technology at this point, social media.
That's right.
So at this point, that it has affected the landscape a lot. Yeah. So a lot of one of the motivating factors when we planted in Richmond was it is the cap city of Virginia. It's a glorious city, and it has a lot of influence in the region. But as the last 15 years have passed, how people interact with ideas, how sociology is shaped, and how that factors into effective mission in your church is just a little bit different on how you're reaching everyone and influencing everybody for Christ.
No, absolutely. And then, and be back to thinking about, me and your connection, just listening to your heart and hearing, conversations about Reformed theology and planting churches. Yeah, that's when I fell in love with you and fell in love with Remnant Church. And I just thought you were a monster. And we just really kicked. And another big piece for you was you really understood. Sometimes I could have a conversation about urban church planning and then it would turn into being accused of race baiting or something.
Right.
And you just, with your R&B background from your dad, you just got the herbs and spices of the hood from a sober.
That's what Drew dug in.
I like herbs and spices.
We were foodies, but
not
that was
R&B.
different.
And so
right,
that was, and the second part for me of that church planning time was, I was a Calvinist at a National Baptist Dispensational Arminian church. So I was undercover. I wasn't allowed to, I was
You
undercover.
might say you were an undercover brother.
Oh my goodness! Speaking of strange references,
Speaking of strange references,
that's quite all right.
And
That's
so for me to be able to have a camp where I could express my views tied to something as corny as this is not wearing a suit and tie.
Right. Yeah. Well, that's how much has changed. I mentioned before we got in here. I mean, part of what I thought was confirmation of my calling came out of white collar. Well, I was blue collar background. We always talk about boots and suits. You and I.
Yes.
Because basically, I had both. I was working blue collar heavy. Then you have to throw on the suit. But when I got saved, I had a closet full of suits. I was like, well, God's called me to pastor, obviously. I mean, I already have all the wardrobe. I just kind of convert it right on. And then we said we need to wear plaid shirts and reach everybody.
Exactly.
It was just weird.
Yeah.
Weird.
So the openness of that. I grew up in a traditional African American church where if you didn't wear a suit and tie, it was like you weren't putting on your best for the Lord.
That's that church clothes.
Yeah, right, and amen. And so that expression where I could go I owned a barbershop and I cut a bunch of dudes from the hood, from Camden, from all over South Jersey, and to share the gospel using hip hop references.
Yeah.
From quoting Big Daddy Kane to debating Rakim's theology of being a God was a big part of my, as most people call it, my barbershop apologetics and leading people to Christ. And I never forget I was doing some barbershop apologetics.
I do think you need to write that as a book. Like barbershop apologetics would be amazing.
and so two ministers from my traditional church were there, and they didn't like the fact that I was using slang to debate with a 5%er about who God was. And one of them stormed out and walked out. And I thought, well, later, when this same dude came to faith about a year and a half later, I just wanted to tell that guy, bro, where is your faith, bro? I am on these streets with these people who are going to hell. They don't have a suit and tie. So if that's the requirement, we're all doomed here in my context. So for me, church planning then was an open expression for me to be who I believe God called me to be, with some Jordans and some polo and my hat backwards.
Right.
And being able to share the gospel on the ground level with the dude who was on drugs, with the dude who sold drugs, with a woman who had baby mama drama and a mother who was mad at her daughter for having baby mama drama. Able to share the gospel across the board with full expression, and to see those people come to faith in jeans and t-shirts. Yeah. And not feel like I have to go get them a suit and tie to come to the church. Yeah. So the church plant movement, many of us came in different ways, but for me, it was finally I could go to the streets, share this gospel. And because the question was, I remember one time I led this person to Christ at the barbershop, and he was like, everybody called me D-Load back then, D-Load. He didn't come to church for a couple of years. I said, "Bro, I thought you said you was coming." He finally put me aside. I ain't got no suit, man. I can't come to church without a suit. Yeah. And I was like, Yeah. And so.
Yeah. Well, this to your missiological point, I felt the same way in a lot of ways, because basic missiology is you're trying to bring the gospel to a people in ways that are understandable to the context. Yeah. That meet them where they're at, and without compromising the message, accommodate well as God has to us, so it's in understandable ways. Mm-hmm. So, coming out of blue collar construction, and then I came into Baptist church life that without this is the old David Foster Wallace that a lot of folks have talked about for years. I know we've talked about before.
Sure.
Essentially, his what was it, Kenyon College? His address.
Yep.
Essentially, it's
This is water.
Yeah, this is water, right? This is how's the water. The church culture at the time didn't realize it had a culture. Right. And it had ways of talking about things, and it had ways of. So it probably was even through the seminary I went to, I feel like I lost myself in a lot of ways because my normal ways of communicating, not just through. I'm not talking about through swear words, although that was a part that I had to leave behind. But there was just much more of a natural colloquialism, if that even is a word, which we didn't use at the time, to reach the folks that I was used to. It was coming from the places I was coming from, and so that was a big component at the time. Was how do we make this good news understandable to the people that actually are in culture at this time that are far from Christ.
As you guys were talking, I was thinking about how so much of the conversation back then really did talk a good deal about contextualization.
It did, yes.
You didn't use that word, but that was what you were describing when you talked about making something understandable. So it wasn't about making something palatable, right?
No.
Or more lovely sounding, because you can't grease the poles to get sinners into heaven.
Well,
That's
to
not
the
how that
point, I
works.
don't know if you remember this, but the Baptists at the time, the only category they had in their culture for what we were trying to do was, you guys, it was a pragmatic category. You guys are trying to be relevant.
Right.
Yeah,
It's
that's
relevant.
Right. That's what
Right.
they said.
Remember?
Yeah,
No,
right.
no,
I do.
we're not trying to be relevant
Sure.
like you think.
That's
That's
right.
not it at all.
Right.
Well, but one of the things
condescending.
that came out of that was probably too many people threw the baby out with the bathwater. I'm talking about people like us who went and started churches, thinking we went from one end of the spectrum, thinking, church equals the form, the decorum, the trappings of things like this. Buildings don't matter. Clothes don't matter. XYZ doesn't matter. And the funny thing is, I look around the way any of us dress on a Sunday morning now and say, man, we probably would have made fun of ourselves 15 years ago if we were talking about this now. Or again, I can just look at other brothers that I know who are kind of saying, yeah, that was a pendulum moment for me.
Sure.
I was reacting hard and I kind of overreacted. And you can see this in the fact that there are certain church traditions that are high church where ministers do wear robes and things like this every Sunday. And some of those churches are growing in certain places around the world. And in even very poor countries, like sub-Saharan Africa, there's an explosion of Anglican growth there. And if the ministers are wearing robes every Sunday, they look very formal, but that's not actually hindering them from reaching those people. So there's a way to think about contextualization that's intelligent and is sensitive to what we are saying, understanding and thought forms. And there's a way to do it poorly, which is like, if I just dress a certain way and make sure I make slang references in my sermons and I quote Taylor Swift, obviously that will win people to Jesus.
That's right.
I think a big part of it, which it was a part of all of our stories that we haven't mentioned yet, not only was church planting popular, but it really was a back to the Bible movement as well. Like we were Bible guys. Like it wasn't, hey, listen, we read some Keller and these are some new things that people are doing and the Bible's our guardrails, just stay in between. Like we were deep into the Bibles. We opened our Bibles. We really saw that the church work we were doing and planting, growing a church was an extension from the early church all the way through. So, curious as y'all think about that, you think back of your time in the word planting, what are some things come to mind?
Well, as you both were talking, I was thinking, we mentioned this, you mentioned this before when we were kind of debriefing before we got in here, Joe, was I'm
scared about
I was
what's
getting
gonna
nervous. I was
happen.
getting nervous.
Me too.
It's so everything has a motivating factor. There's nothing wrong with being reactionary.
Oh yeah,
if you
will
ultimately
be.
Something moved you to do something. Right. A lot of it was a proper recognition of a need. You mentioned Calvinism as passing. That's not a small thing. At the time, it was. This is Time Magazine. I think when was that? It was like late 2000s or mid 2000s. Had the new Calvinism was one of the fastest growing movements or that sort of thing at the time. What was needed at the time was not a big God gospel. It was much more. The landscape had devolved in really functionally liberal ways, where personal experience reigned, and the Bible was recognized as essentially there was a lot of a confession about the Bible being the Word of God in churches. but functionally it didn't actually have the authority of the Word of God.
Right.
That's right.
The people still stood in the driver's seat. So when the new Calvinism came on the scene, it essentially had a high view of God, high Christology, high doctrine of Scripture as the ultimate authority over us, and what it looks like to be Christians is bringing ourselves under that word, in terms of our mission and our life, practice, all the rest of it. And that was primary, especially at the time.
Right.
I don't know if that's honestly what's primary right now, though.
Yeah, I that's an interesting thought. I'm not sure about that, but
I don't think it is.
to what you were saying, Joe, about really there's two ways somebody could get into something like starting new churches, something like church planting. One is a pragmatic starting point that starts like C. Peter Wagner in 1990 wrote a book called Church Planting for Greater Harvest. Now, he's way outside of our theological tribe. However, he has a quote in that book that Tim Keller later popularized, and everybody just kind of ran with it. The quote says something to the effect of, the single most effective strategy for reaching, the lost is church planting. That is the way to do it. The best way to do it. Now, it may be, or it may not be. And there's some stats that suggest, that could be, but maybe not for the reasons that some people have thought it was. And so you could start with that point. But the danger of starting with that point, I think, could be 20 years later, somebody else could come along and say, actually, the single most effective strategy for reaching lost people is having a multi-ethnic church or having this kind of church. So there's all kinds of ways of taking things that actually have good theology and turning it into a pragmatic thing that sets you up for being a guy who's going to chase fads and trends the rest of your life instead of the Bible, which is very clear. I even love in the CSB, which is what I have here today, they even title Acts 14 as church planting. But listen to what he says. He says, after they preached the gospel in that town, that's Paul and his traveling companions.
By the way, this is what President Logan's already brought up.
I love it. I love it. Great minds think alike, right? Yeah. After they preached the gospel in that town and made many disciples, they returned to Lystra, to Iconium, and to Antioch, doing what? Strengthening the disciples by encouraging them to continue in the faith and telling them it is necessary to go through many hardships to enter the kingdom of God. And when they had appointed elders for them in every church and prayed with fasting, they committed them to the Lord in whom they had believed. So what do you have? You have guys traveling to a place, evangelizing the lost, discipling those who get saved, and then appointing elders, and then moving on. And so there's a wonderful biblical justification for what we call church planting. It's just not a great idea to adopt it because somebody somewhere told you that's going to be the silver bullet that makes it happen. The best way, the real reason to do it is that's how we started. That's how we continue to move forward.
That's right.
That's how God's kingdom's going to grow.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and my capture from that passage, yours was very pretty. Thank you. Paul got beat down early on in this passage as the Judaizers pursued, and as the pagans, he went from worship to whooping, and that was a big deal. I mean, every move we think about, we always celebrate the resistance, right?
Sure. Right.
Star Wars, the resistance. Lord of the Rings, the resistance. All the resistance. And it's Acts 14 for me was the resistance.
Sure.
And especially for me in my context in Kensington and Camden. And that's what church planting was for me.
Sure.
I was not of the standard hooping, preaching camp. Dr. Evans was my hero. In many ways still is, and Dr. Loritz. I listened to those guys preach with a level of theological astuteness and clarity, and they didn't wear robes and they didn't hoop and holler. I'm not mad at hooping. I love some great hooping. There's some great preachers out there who do, but I really gravitated towards them, and theirs was for me, I was outside of my comfort zone or my color zone at that point, which was the traditional Black Baptist church. I just sensed God calling me into something else. And I had experiences, my wife is white, and I had experiences of racism against her in my traditional Black church. So, and listen, we can call it prophecy or not. I never forget what the preacher said to me that day, that I was going to pastor a church of young people, as they called them, as they would say, multiracial. They wouldn't say multi-ethnic. They would
I remember when we planted. There was a developer in the area that I knew, and we wanted to rent the building. And I met with him, and he said, "Oh, you're doing that youth thing."
Right.
It was all I could do to go. Yeah, that's what I'm doing.
Yeah.
Just doing a little youth thing.
You disagreed with him, so he would give us the building.
Oh, yeah, I had to, but everything in me said,
Pragmatism,
no,
baby.
I'm here for you, sir. You need to come to faith.
Yes, yes.
But I kept it together a little bit, in a good way.
But I just kept coming back to that. And for me, it was the resistance because I got looked at funny from my traditional Black Baptist churches. They looked at me like I was a weird dude. First, I had a white wife. Second, I was doing, young people church. Right. With, jeans.
Well, this to you guys' point, I think one of the big takeaways, especially at the time, is always it's a biblical motivation.
Yeah,
our theology drives us to mission.
Right.
The scriptures show us how the gospel goes forth in the world, that we evangelize and churches plant churches.
Right.
As qualified men are sent out to take that gospel and start new churches.
Sure.
And then that is the basis by which all of our methodologies are actually assessed. But without realizing that or being very cognizant of that along the way, you can have the tail wagging the dog, or you devolve into ministry pragmatism that's out of step with faithful theology.
Absolutely.
Or not in accordance with the scriptures, or implicitly undermines actually what you confess to believe. Right. That then lands in an ineffective mission a lot of times.
I mean, it was, I remember being a heuristic of mine, because back in that day, and certainly continuing to this day, the good and the goofy often mix together, and it's kind of hard as well. Where are you on that spectrum? And so I just remember I wanted to be around men in a similar kind of ministry who opened their Bibles and believed what it said about Jesus and everything else as well. And so, you and I, our backgrounds could not be more diverse. But when we got together and
it was party time.
You can't be in the room with you without being like, what does that Bible say? Like, I was like, all right, I like this guy.
That's right. Yeah.
There's a lot about us that's different, but the thing that's the same is our love for Christ.
What
our love
he's
for His
saying
word.
is he thought you were goofy up front, and then he found out you were good because you kept asking, "What's the Bible say?"
That's right. You keep talking about the Bible. I like this guy.
All I had was a Bible. I didn't have a degree.
But to your point too, Joe, you were very aware of there is good and goofy.
Yeah.
And I need to be mindful of this as a way that I process whether or not I'd be effective in the mission.
Yeah, I realized I was good and goofy. Both me, I was.
Everybody got a mix of questions whether you are actually trying to do away with the goofy and keep pressing with the good.
With the good, amen.
Right.
Amen.
But I'm not, without that awareness, I'm not sure how effective, we are in church planting or whether, or whether we've lost a little bit of that clarity.
Sure.
Of how the scriptures relate to church planting and have to be the grounding and the basis and the standard by which all church planting is measured. The success of your church planting is actually measured.
Yeah, and that's where that unity comes in. That's why when I come down to Culpeper to Christ Cove, it was easy peasy to hang where and fall in love with you and the family. When I get to Remnant, when I came to Richmond, under Bryan's leadership, just fell in love with him and his heart, because we were all Bible dudes. Yeah. We were all trying to get after the lost, and the unity and the reality around the Word of God took off the modifiers from urban to city to suburban, because that Bible has nothing but God, and we all went to our different contexts, but we found unity, grace, and friendship.
Yeah, sure. I think over the years, I don't know if it's too far afield, but kind of led us to where we are here today. Is through the planting process. It's great if I think it's a fair analogy to church plans like starting a family. Yeah, it's wonderful that you found a wife and now you guys are having some children. Yeah, that's wonderful. But what you realize very fast is you might have thought that was it. Yeah. But along the way, you realize, I have to actually raise these kids. Mm-hmm. I have to see us become a healthy family. I have to actually see them come to love the Lord and grow up and be well-formed adults and all the rest of it. Yeah. And so as we were, I think a lot of church plan at the time was kind of, let's get married and start a family. It's going to be amazing.
It's going to be amazing.
And then the attrition over time, without it actually well thought through, was there was a great need to make sure that not only the churches were healthy, but the men that were planting these churches were growing in such ways and trained well so that they could not just start well, but end well and persevere well or continue well. Sure. And we've seen a lot because of that. There's there's been a great need, and even a greater need even today,
Yeah.
because a lot of folks that started well have not finished well.
Yeah.
I mean, one of the things I can say, I mean, the last couple of years has just been personally difficult. Because the majority at this point of men that we planted and started with are no longer in pastoral ministry. They're not planning. They're not in pastoral ministry at all.
Some of them aren't even Christians.
Right. So so some of the old metrics were, they let go of your funding around 3 to 5 years, somewhere like that, and that'll get you very far anyway.
Right.
But that was where the metrics of
2007.
success were. Yeah. And then now 10, 15, 20 years. If there's not lasting fruit bore out, it's something that needs to be maybe thought about more intentionally, so that we actually plant healthy churches.
Yeah. There was an organization that used to give out an Eagle Trophy to every church that they planted, and after about 5 years of watching these Eagle Trophies get handed out to these churches when they were started. Imagine giving somebody the gold medal when you start. Right. We saw the huge numbers of them die within 5 years, huge numbers. And at one point, one of the guys I worked with, who remain nameless, said, "What we ought to start doing is putting eagle tombstones, right, representing every one of these churches on the front lawn of this organization."
We were more cynical then.
I don't know that was cynical, but
we think it's worth noting. Right?
I think we definitely were more cynical then. I don't know that was a cynical take. If you love people, you love the church, you love the lost, and you care about the souls who've been entrusted to the pastoral oversight of particular men, then it breaks your heart to see people with great zeal, but not according to knowledge, as Paul says, who are sent out in a way that is ultimately counterproductive and harmful to many people.
Yeah, that's right.
And it breaks your heart to see people getting celebrated and you get more of that because you tend to get more of what you incentivize. That's right. So if everybody sitting in that group saw people go up on stage and get an Eagle Trophy because they went through a 6-week training course and decided they were going to start a new church with some harebrained idea and go off and do it, and then they never hear about the guy's church falling apart and everybody scattering to the four winds and people leaving the faith and all the rest of that. Every other Tom, Dick, and Harry in the room says, I kind of would like an Eagle Trophy too.
Yeah, this is back to your point, Joe, of how would I think about it now?
Yeah.
I would say we need to I think about it a little bit more soberly. And I think we need to think a lot more soberly about not just who we're sending out, but how are they being faithful? Because the detriment not only to their own families, and them not being able to persevere well in the faith.
That's right.
But also the unintended hardships that it brings on the folks that are involved in those church plants as they actually go through these things.
Yeah.
And I think there's too much flippancy on the landscape of saying, well, that's just kind of that's just the cost of the mission. Sometimes it's going to work, sometimes it's going to not work out. A lot of that's comes maybe from a place that doesn't reflect well on the scriptures and what they require of us as we plant and pastor churches, so that they'll be healthy.
That's right.
And the men that plant the churches with their families and with God's people actually have a faithful witness over years and years and years.
Sure. So,
and we just it's been detrimental to see that it hasn't. If you go back 15 years ago, I thought we're going to take the world, and none of that's going to happen. Right. 15 years later, I would say maybe we didn't think about it well enough, and we need to think a little deeper about it.
Oh yeah. I mean, but it's that Iron Man gospel. I think early on we were all Iron Man, and then by the time you get to the third Avengers, he's got a child living in a cabin, and he's thinking differently than he was. Yeah. He was more Tony Stark at the end. In the beginning, he was all Iron Man. By the end, he was Tony. I'm more Tony Stark now, and so I am thinking about different things, and I'm thinking soberly, much more sober. But maturity is real. I just think we just got to grow up. We can't perpetuate these men planning these churches into being a Toys R Us kid all their life. There has to be a level of maturity, development, understanding. And I love the energy and the zeal in the beginning. As Pastor Doug said, maybe we can encapsulate that without, turning it into earning a thing for your mantelpiece.
Right.
But yeah, I do love metrics of celebration along the way.
Sure.
Yeah, I want to celebrate a guy that wants to plant. And I also want to celebrate the milestones of those years. And so,
I always think about Kimbo Slice.
Good old Kimbo.
Kimbo.
Street fighter.
For better or worse, I used to love watching the street fighting viral videos. I mean, the man will punk guys down. I'm not saying it was Christian evil to watch them. However, I did. And then he went professional.
Yeah.
And
didn't go so well.
He found out very quickly Kimbo had a lot of things to learn.
Yes, sir.
And I always think about kind of the movement we were part of. We had a lot of Kimbos out there.
Yes, we did.
And everybody,
some brawlers.
So we had some brawlers. And then a lot of folks got it handed to them.
Yes, sir.
And
when they ran up on a technician.
Called the devil.
That's right.
And he handed it to him. And so I think when we think about church planting, the type of men and the type of churches that they desire to plant requires a lot more depth of assessment, a lot more time of maturing in healthy churches.
Yeah.
A lot more well-formed theology, not just a couple little tidbits and throw on some pragmatic spice and make it happen.
Right.
But actually a richness where the roots are well-formed in these men as they've been serving the church over years, so that they're sent out and they actually don't get hijacked by the devil.
So that would be interesting because we, probably at this table we probably assessed probably close to 100 planners between the four of us.
Easy.
Easily. Yeah. We've told some stories about folks, and our hope would be that to this podcast we might have some guys who are considering planting, maybe some planters. So when you're thinking about the kinds of things that should be present in a church planter that helps him discern his call to actually plant. Every planter is a pastor. Not every pastor is a planter.
That's right.
What are some things come to mind? Not an exhausted list, but maybe some things that stand out. This is what I want to see in a church planter.
Well, I just want to start with something you said that's really important before we go on to make distinctions. There's no such thing as a church planter who is not also a man who's qualified to be a pastor. Right. The title planter is not even in the Bible. That doesn't make it bad. It doesn't make it wrong. It doesn't make it not real. It just means we have to use the words that are in the Bible to talk about whatever it is that we're trying to do with the Bible.
Right.
So what we're doing is we're
shepherd.
sending out a man who's qualified to be a shepherd of souls according to the qualifications that are given in the New Testament. And one of the things that is interesting here as well is I was playing devil's advocate in my mind as you were talking a moment ago, Bryan, about what would somebody say back to this.
I feel like you're doing that often when I'm talking.
I do it often when everybody talks. Always trying to anticipate objections, but not to object to you, but actually to think how might somebody object to what you're saying. And they're saying, well, when you guys all started, you had a prophecy in a barbershop and you were a Christian for 2 weeks and somebody sent you to seminary and now you're telling everybody not to do it like that. And I'm saying, what we're also saying is there are a lot of people who had that story with us and aren't in ministry anymore. Right. But they might be if we had. So we don't want some kind of standards that are so high that no one can become a pastor and a planter. That's absurd. But neither do we want them to be so low that everybody with a beating heart and a Bible in their hand and a crazy harebrained idea says, probably he's ready. He's ready. I don't know about that.
Right.
So where do we go?
Right.
We go back to the scriptures.
Yeah.
And notice even the development within the Bible. The book of Acts is not a blueprint for the modern church, full stop. There's some things in it that are enduring, perennial, perpetual, but there's a lot of things that happen in there that this was a unique moment of redemptive history. Sure. This is the beginnings of the church, but it's not the end of the church's story.
Right.
And there's a reason why by the time you get to the end of the New Testament, to the pastoral epistles, there's a good deal more order and form and structure and qualifications that are being codified for these churches so that they can make sure, are we calling the right kind of man to carry on this great work that's been entrusted to us?
Look at the epistles chronologically rather than how they occur in the Bible.
So exactly. Look at the trajectory that's in the New Testament itself. And all that to say, what kind of man should he be? At a minimum, he should be the kind of man who can pastor a church according to the New Testament standards.
Yeah.
Many thoughts come to mind, to be honest. Patience. You're never not where God wants you to be in a lot of ways. If He wants you to plan, He'll get you there, and He gets you there through the means that He prescribes in the Scriptures. I think there's one dangers in planting is you kind of have the qualifications end up being kind of flat, where they all are equally important. But the scriptures are very clear, as you've said, Doug, on the character of the man far outweighs necessarily his effectiveness in ministry,
right. His skill set,
his ability to teach. Can he make it hot?
His
for
seminary
people?
degrees.
Yeah, do people think he's amazing when he gets up there and teaches?
Right.
The question is, are you actually a faithful, godly man? Mm-hmm. Have you proven that through being faithful in the first things?
Yeah.
Finding a wife, cultivating multiple kids.
Yeah.
Those sorts of things. Can you manage your household well? Is the fruit of the Spirit present in your life? Are you not a novice? Are you are you Christ-like? And then do you actually have the prerequisite skills that actually accord with someone who is able to plant a church?
Yeah.
Can you say, as Paul does, follow me as I follow Christ?
Right.
So some people can't even say that because of the lack of courage. They're thinking, I would never tell somebody to follow me. That's a terrifying thought. Well, that's probably a good sign the Lord hasn't called you into this work.
Right.
So A, can you say that? And then B, does anybody actually listen? Do they actually want to follow? Because you could be like, you could stand on the street corner and be like, follow me as I follow Christ. And people are looking at you and everything about you. And they're like, I know who I'm not following today.
Well, Mark Driscoll used to say years ago, I remember him saying this, folks that were inspired to plant churches. And they would say, I can teach. And he would say, okay, great. Does anybody actually listen to you? Mm-hmm. Does anybody care what you say? Do they actually, are they transformed by that? Mm-hmm. Now, if that's the only metric,
sure.
Then that can be problematic.
But if that's not there at all, it's also problematic.
That's right.
There's a lot of incredibly sweet, godly, deeply Christian, maybe more mature than their pastor, older saints in a church. But in God's providence, He didn't give them all that they need to serve as a pastor. Sure, and that's not a knock against them. And as long as we don't have this two-tiered system in the kingdom where we think, well, pastors are extra special and other people who aren't pastors are not, then a lot of the incentives to seek something out that the Lord may not have fitted you for kind of go away. Because you don't feel like you have to do it in order to be someone for the Lord or do something for His kingdom. You're just free to be who God made you and to work through these things as you're wrestling with the scriptures, the desires He's putting in your heart, and listening to the people who are around you and how they're affirming or directing or redirecting what they think the Lord might be calling you into, whether it's this or something else.
Yeah. I'm working on a book called No Be Do Have, 12 Essentials for a Church Planner.
That sounds like a New York Times bestseller.
No Be Do
Got to be a leadership book.
Yeah, 4 categories.
No Be Do Have.
Something every church planner needs to know, he needs to be, he needs to do, and he needs to have.
That's good.
Needs to have your book.
That's right.
Amen. And I've been working on it so long, I think it's never going to come out because it's irrelevant every time I relook at it.
Yep.
But sadly, I'm going to say this, but I think it's pertinent. You need to know Christ.
Yeah.
You need to know the Bible. You need to have a church. And one of the B's in my book is you need to be a member of a church.
That's right.
And it's ridiculous that I have to say that, but a lot of churches are planted out of this antagonistic presupposition. They're going to prove somebody wrong, and they haven't even been members of a church.
Yeah, that's great.
Yeah.
They haven't been members of a church. So a part of that 12 Essentials was you have to be a church member.
Yeah, that's right.
And now down to the have, I'll get pushed back for that, but I think you need to have a sending church.
Oh, you have to.
And I think you need to have, this is where I'll get pushed back, a spiritual father.
Thought you'd bring that up. I was going to ask you if you didn't.
I think that's Timothy had one.
See, to your point, though, that's part of the commission.
Right.
Nobody's sent from a church under qualified pastors that serve as your overseeing leaders.
Exactly.
And therefore, in the scriptures, that's a Paul-Timothy type of relationship.
Sure.
No, absolutely. And when I say spiritual, I don't mean some Yoda dude. No, to your point, the elders of that church that I can come to who are caring for me, challenging me. I'm able to be rebuked. I'm not the expert in the room. When I came to the room with Eric Mason and Paul Tripp, I couldn't out-Bible them with my sin. They would be like, hey, bro, shut up, stop it. And I couldn't say, well, the Greek. Because they said, no, you're saying it wrong. And so therefore, we need that relationship where there's both care, commitment, mixed with challenge and correction. See, everybody has this coach dude who, cares for them and coaches them. But coaches get paid to care and coach, not correct. Yeah. And so we need a correction dude, and you can't fire your father. And so for me, that was essential when I look at Timothy, Titus, Epaphras, Onesimus. Paul calls them sons. That's a big, big deal. Now, I'm not saying we need to find this Paul Yoda figure.
No.
But I'm saying that a group of elders that sent me, I could go to each one of them and be corrected, challenged, and comforted and cared for.
Sure.
And
I love that. I think the only thing I would say for anybody who might be listening and saying, well, I don't have that, I would say, well, that doesn't necessarily disqualify you from this sort of work. However, if the church that you're in doesn't have pastors like that, it may be time to find one that does.
Right.
And that this story that I'm thinking of is a hypothetical example that does happen, is the exception that proves the rule of what you're saying. In other words, that's the kind of thing you should want to have.
Yes.
And the fact that you don't have it and can't get it is just a sign of how much more desperately healthy churches and healthy church leaders are needed, because this ought to be a no-brainer. This ought to be the kind of thing where we're like, well, yeah, of course, duh.
Well, to your point, that also would be an unintended example of pragmatism. So a lot of guys do look around and go, well, I don't have that church. They don't have that type of church community around me. The humble question would say, well, how did you get here? How did you get here? As some Christian nomad floating through the heavens, chasing careers, not being ecclesiocentric, not actually seeing yourself as a part of the body of Christ.
Right.
That needs to be putting yourself and everyone else around you and your family into a healthy church.
Sure.
And the church becomes the center of how you navigate
Yeah.
your life in Christ. There's no healthy church planner sent out who's not steeped for a long period of time in a healthy church.
Yeah, I wasn't thinking of a guy who had no church. I was thinking of a guy who lives in a small town with the only church in town, and it is really in a busted place.
Yeah, I'm not saying there's not difficult circumstances, but normally the exceptions become the rules constantly.
Yeah, and shouldn't be. They're supposed to prove the rule.
Right.
That's right.
The rule is there ought to be this structure of elders who are qualified and capable of doing the very thing that Paul does with Timothy, where he says it's like the unofficial, maybe it's official, semi-official verse motto for our seminary where we all work. But what you have seen and heard from me, right? Entrust to faithful men who are able to teach others also. Right, yeah. And if a pastor can't do that, if he can't reproduce himself, what is he even doing?
What is he even doing?
Because doctors should be able to reproduce themselves in the next generation of doctors, and teachers do that with teachers. Yeah. And so it's a strange scenario to envision a world like we have, where there are men who are serving as pastors that are incapable of reproducing themselves in others.
And that's a custom in every pagan religion. And for us, we're fighting for it. Yeah. When we clearly see it. Every other religion has a discipleship, almost cloning module built into the fabric of it. And our that Timothy piece is major. That's that 2 Timothy. That's a major deal that I think is largely ignored. We got to grab hold to that.
Yeah.
And
it's too much self-appointment.
Yeah.
There still is. There's still too much self-appointment on the landscape. And even if you find yourself in the small town situation that you talked about, normally that guy, because been that guy in a lot of ways, you look around, you may be in that church saying, well, I think I could do better than this. Better than this guy. That doesn't mean that you know what you're supposed to do. Right. That just means you think that you're not going to make as much of a wreck as he did.
Sure.
But you still, that doesn't necessarily mean that you're soberly qualified in ways that are going to produce a lasting church plant.
Yeah,
right. And there's a prevailing didactic lie right now that you can get what you need to know for whatever you want to do from the internet.
Right.
And so people didn't
Google church plan.
Right. People didn't, so for example, if I wanted to change the oil in my car, I could go to YouTube. If I wanted to become a master auto mechanic, I need to go find a master auto mechanic and spend years with him. But we don't think that way anymore, even though we used to. There used to be apprenticeships and guilds. If you were going to be good at what you did, a master craftsman at what you did, you needed to go find one and spend a long time with him.
Barbershop.
We just don't think about that anymore.
No.
So you have guys like I watched a lot of Paul Washer on YouTube, and I read all of Wayne Grudem's systematic. I'm ready to go.
Yeah.
Like, no.
Yeah.
No. Like, it's not bad, but you need way more.
In the old church, we would say, some got sent and some just went.
Right.
Right. We want them sent, to your point.
Right.
And it is an apprenticeship process.
It is.
The intangibles of
Right.
caring for souls and stewarding God's word week after week after week to build up the body and exalt Christ
Right.
is something that you cannot get on the internet.
Sure.
You cannot get merely in a seminary classroom even.
Yeah.
It's something that you have to do alongside as a faithful churchman in your church.
Right.
On top of all this, the most common word used in the New Testament for the office that we refer to as pastor is actually the word elder. And the word elder conveys a sense of maturity and wisdom. And wisdom is something you cannot get from the internet. You just can't. You could have ChatGPT write your sermons for you. The Lord will judge you, but you could have it do it for you.
And they won't be too good.
You can have it write your. You could have it. You could even have it in a couple years. You could have it answer every email you get.
There you go.
Right. So I want you to answer this email in my style.
Throw in some
based
Bible
on this
verses.
other email. Make sure you include a Bible verse. And the Lord sees all this, and He'll judge people for not even caring enough about people to give them that.
Don't use cheat
My point is,
GPT.
you can fake your way through a lot of what we think of as pastoral ministry today. But you know what you can't do? You can't get wisdom from the internet. You can't get it from a computer.
Right.
You can only get that from walking with people who themselves are mature and know how to take information that by itself is black and white, it's objective, but it's not applied, and then look at the circumstances and say, and here's what to do with that in this moment, in this time, in this place, because so much of pastoral ministry isn't going to have a chapter and verse. Right? It just doesn't. And the only way you're going to be able to figure it out is by walking with people who've been there before, have done it,
Had to
and
figure
can
it out.
say, let me tell you what I did when I got to this place. And then they pour into you, and then you're able to take that and figure out how to do it when you encounter situations that are similar.
No, absolutely.
I wouldn't say I'm pessimistic at this point, but I would say years ago I was overly optimistic. I think we need to be realistic.
Sure.
In accordance with the scriptures. The scriptures give us great hope.
Right.
That the gospel, the Lord does triumph. He triumphs through his word, through the good news going forth. And so the need to plant churches.
Oh, yeah. We need more.
Yeah, we need more. And
It's greater than ever.
It's greater than ever.
Yeah, the
and we
need's
should be
greater than
hopeful
ever.
that the Lord's growing his kingdom and folks are coming to know him through church planting. We just want to do it in a way that actually honors him and thinks very reverently about it.
Right. And I mean, I'll add one more thing that is going to sound discouraging and end up hopefully encouraging. And I'll actually even start with a little bit of a hedge. So it's church planters have a really bad habit. I did it of saying like, I'm doing the really hard work. And this is just super difficult. And you need to show me honor because this is the hardest thing. You've got pastors like, pastoral ministry is hard, whether you're church planting or not. So it was like when you did church in hard places. I said, my church is in a hard place. Like, come do it in my place. And you were doing a particular style of ministry in particularly difficult places.
Sure.
But one of the things that a church planter needs to be prepared for is to endure a unique and particular kind of hardship. And you just need men that are ready for that and know that and go into that eyes open. I've never known church planters who have planted into peace on every side. It's just hard and difficult. Like it just is. It's conflict, a unique kind of loneliness. You plant a church, Satan's coming after your family. Trying to find elders and train them up, having people come to the church who all of a sudden they've got huge needs, or people leave the church and leave loudly. It is particularly difficult, and men need to know that going in.
You can start with a resume or a startup loan. Church planting is the startup loan. The resume gets you into an existing company where you become the boss of something built.
It's true.
The startup loan says we got to find a place, we got to find the people, we got to go to GoDaddy.com if they even use that anymore for a name.
Oh my God!
There we go.
Showing your age.
We'll take care of that for you at this point.
The encouraging part is it's worth it.
Yeah.
And so it isn't, we are not trying to discourage called and qualified church planters. We're trying to say, go in eyes open, get some guys around you, get a mentor, make sure you meet biblical requirements. We need more church planters. So,
And it's beyond them.
right.
Church planting has to have a multi-generational philosophy from day zero.
Yeah.
So often it's about getting through a church plant. Now, man, this is Professor Ponder has clearly taken us, teaches the faithful men who will teach it to others.
Yes.
And that has to be front loaded into the church planning minivan before we start. Because if it's only about you planning your church, you can't be more selfish.
Yeah.
But it's about us contributing to the advancement of the kingdom through the vision of reaching the lost, through church planting, pastoring, books, and the whole kingdom advancing strategies that the scriptures outlay. It cannot be, I'm going to plant this church so I can be a church planting ninja. Ha ha, shaka shaka.
I think as folks are listening, it's worth keeping in mind because you can get overwhelmed very fast.
Right.
Dr. Beckton, who teaches with us, is our professor of spiritual formation. He's been a pastor for 40 plus years.
Great spiritual father.
What's that?
Great spiritual father.
Yes, and he's multi-generational. His dad was a pastor for a lifetime as well. And his dad was passing. He told me the story. His dad was passing. You know, he's trying to consider all these things. He's in pastoral ministry, and he's saying, how do I do all these things I'm hearing about?
Right.
The last hour plus. How do I do all these things? And he finally, as he's asking him all this, basically on his deathbed, he's trying to get everything out of his dad he can. And his dad, kind of leans over, puts his hand on him, yeah, give me that hand. And he goes, son, just be faithful. Just be faithful. That's really what it boils down to.
Amen.
The Lord builds his church.
That's so good.
You have to just be dependent on him and his word and be faithful.
That's good.
And leave the results in his hands.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
And church planning, just like all the Christian life, it just really boils down to we just need to be faithful to the Lord is faithful to us.
I agree. I think that's probably a good place to at least end this part of the conversation about church planning. I'm sure it'll come up again, but at least for now, it's been encouraging, guys. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Praise God. Good to be here.